live. Scary, 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 scary. Okay, and I now actually see the. Do I see the comments? Yes. Okay, so my streaming app also has the comments, which is good. So I think we're okay. This is looking good. Cool.
Great.
Um, the okay. So this is the interesting segment where. Okay, no, we're actually live right now. Okay, good. Hi everyone. My name is Vincent. I'm here with my colleague Aciel. We're going to be talking to you today about success markers. We were just briefly in the situation where we're just trying to make sure the audiovisual stuff is working, and we've just confirmed the audiovisual stuff seems to be working. So that's great. So just as a very quick introduction, my name is Vincent. I'm the research advocate here at Rasa. I do my best to explain what algorithms we have and how you could use them. But we're in for a special treat today because we actually have a researcher today that's also going to talk about stuff that we've been doing. Aciel, anything you would like people to know about you? You've been at Rasa for a while now, and you've been mainly in the research team, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I joined in January, and I'm a machine learning researcher. I've been mostly working in the research team, but recently I moved to work in one of the engineering squads called the Enable Squad, which works on the open source software. And yeah, I've been embedded into the squad in order to, I guess, demonstrate what a cross-functional team might look like, where researchers are working closely with the engineers.
Yep, and because of that, and that's kind of why we're talking here today, because we're going to be talking about success markers, which in a way doesn't have anything to do with tensors. Like it's not no tensors are flowing when you're doing success markers. So in that sense, people might think like, why is that sort of a research topic? But it's actually because of the intersection between what the Enable team typically does and what people in research are typically doing. So just to introduce the topic, I think might be fun. Like, how did the success marker feature get started? Do you remember kind of when that happened, how that happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first joined Rasa, we were talking about different ways to evaluate our bots or different ways for customers to evaluate. And we started working on a number of prototypes. And one of them was markers. In earlier stages, it was called something else. But the idea is that it's very simple. It's you want to be able to mark important points in your dialogue. And you can then use this idea for a multiple or a number of downstream applications. So for example, you want to mark when a successful event happens. So for example, your bot has a particular task that it wants to perform, and you want to be able to say when it performed the task or when it failed to perform the task and mark these important points.
So just to give a little bit of an example there, like what would be a success? Let's go with Moodbot. If you type Rasa in it, that's like the standard assistant that you get, and like the whole point of that is that we're trying to make an assistant to cheer you up. So I would in this case, like, right, you can say something like, okay, if we were able to cheer you up, that would have been a successful event. Like that's the gist, I suppose, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, for Moodbot, so being able to successfully cheer a user up when they're unhappy is considered as task success, whereas failing to cheer them up would be failure. But yeah, you could think of other bots. For example, if you have other applications, for example, you're booking a restaurant. So if you're able to book the restaurant for a user, then that's a successful outcome versus failing to book the restaurant, or the user saying they want to talk to a human, so a human handoff, or the user dropping off of the call. You might consider these as different modes of failure, or you might want to track them in order to investigate further what happened.
And then that's kind of the whole thing about the way that's been designed. Is also, I think, my favorite feature about it. The hard part is that we at the research team at Rasa, or like we at Rasa, we don't really know what success could look like for your assistant. It really, really depends on what your assistant does, right? So what I thought was pretty neat about it is you're able to say, well, there's these moments inside of a story. Typically, there's an intent or a slot was set, or those can be like points that you use in your marker definition, so to say. And then we leave it completely up to anyone to use those to just define events of interest. So yeah, that's the quick introduction, I suppose, to success markers. If people have been watching us on Monday, and you will have also seen a very quick demo. So I still have a couple of questions I would like to ask Aciel about these success markers. But if people have questions in the meantime, feel free to ask them in the chat as well, because we're definitely here to answer any questions that people might have. Just thinking out loud, Aciel, like, what's the, like, have you seen any, did you have like a typical demo in mind when you were designing these success markers? Or was it more of a general problem you were interested in solving?
So it was interesting because we were thinking of a number of ways to evaluate your bot. And then we were thinking about what do all of these things have in common. So for example, one of the things that kept coming up is we want to just be able to measure task success and failure, just to be able to quantify how good the bot is, which is what we talked about. Another thing is maybe you want to diagnose your bot. So you notice some strange behavior and you want to first quantify how often it happens, and then you want to dig deeper into the problem. So in that case, you also want to specify the pattern that you observed, and then be able to mark it in dialogues and then surface these dialogues for inspection. So we had a number of applications in mind like that, and we had been developing prototypes. And it was interesting because different researchers ended up implementing something very similar for different for different solutions. And we thought, wait, all of these things have one thing in common, and we could start by actually delivering that into the production software for people to use, and then maybe start introducing some of the other ideas later on.
So that's a nice little bridge to the first question that just came in. In which case do you really recommend this feature? Are there situations where you think like, hey, this is where success markers are going to make the most difference? And or are there situations where you think, well, maybe success markers won't help you so much?
Yeah, so I think at the moment, the way you evaluate your assistant is by evaluating the different components separately. So, the entity extraction, intent detection, action selection. And because all of these are implemented as classifiers, you can basically just compute accuracy on a held out test set. But this doesn't tell you how well your assistant performs on the task that it was designed for. So in that case, I would really recommend actually thinking about what is the task, or it might be multiple tasks that your assistant, that you've designed your assistant to solve. And you need to maybe come up with a clear definition of what that looks like and write down a number of markers to identify when it happens. And I think that's, yeah, I mean, I would think that's applicable to all task-oriented bots. And it's pretty useful, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. That I guess the only caveat there, I suppose, if you're really just getting started, like you're at version 0 of your assistant, and like you're sharing it to your colleague the first time, then success markers may not be top of mind because you're just still kind of trying to figure out, what features should my assistant even have. So if you're really, really starting out, then maybe success markers won't make that much of an impact. But definitely when something's in production, I would also.
I think.
To answer the
yeah,
question.
I mean, it depends. I think if you've designed a bot for a specific task, then it's also useful to know what success looks like for your bot, even if it's early on. And this means it doesn't mean that you have to stick to the markers that you develop. You could iteratively improve your markers, or maybe change the definition of success as you go along. But it's useful to say what success looks like, especially when there's a task involved. I think for maybe open domain bots where it's kind of more like chit chat, it's a lot harder to say what success looks like there. But if it's a task-oriented bot, then I think you can always say what success looks like.
Yeah, now that you say it out loud, I think you're right. Even when you're starting out, you probably still have a task in your mind. And if you don't, you probably should. So no, so like honestly, if nothing else, you could make the argument, if nothing else, success markers are a useful exercise to do. Just for you as a designer, you need to be mentally aware of the tasks that you want to get done, and if nothing else, a success marker will just be the act of writing that down, which is a very sensible idea just from that point of view. We did get another question from Jasmine on this topic. Does it work for both rules and stories? And what about end-to-end training?
Yeah, so actually it works. So I don't know if this user has already looked at the feature. So it's basically you've built the bot, you've run it, you've collected a number of dialogues, and then markers is an additional thing that you write after that. And it's written in a language similar to rules. And it is actually a deterministic process of identifying these points in the dialogue. So I think at the moment it's more applicable to an intent-based bot because the events that you can detect are intent detected, slot was set, and action executed. So we don't have any events where you would maybe identify a very specific utterance that the user has made, but rather at the intent level. So in that case, it's not super applicable to an end-to-end bot, I think, unless you're just focusing on actions executed and slots set, and yeah, without the intents.
Yeah, slots. Well, you still have the slots, but one thing that might also be good to mention is that like this is the first version of the success markers that we've released. It's probably not going to be the last version, I think. Aciel can confirm this more than I can, but it is like a ball that we intend to keep on rolling, and I think end-to-end has a couple of rough edges to it, but I can definitely imagine maybe someday in the future, you still want to be able to track success even if you're using end-to-end. So it's not something that will never happen per se, but it is something that we don't support right now.
That's right. Yeah. So we, in this first version, we focused on 3 kinds of events, and they're the ones that I mentioned. So action executed, intent detected, and slot set. But we could extend, we could extend the feature to look at maybe an entire user utterance. Although I think it requires a bit more thought. So the intent, specifying things at the intent level has the advantage of abstracting one level away from the exact utterance that the user has specified. But yeah, we would be considering additional events in the future that might be more applicable to end-to-end.
There's some new questions coming in as well, so I'll just pick up the next one. Jonathan asks, is there a way to access the marker data real time through a custom action or straight SQL? Like, are the markers saved in the tracker, or do they generate when the command is run?
Yeah, very cool question. So we did consider whether to have the markers apply as the dialogue is happening versus applying it at the end. And we decided for the first version to do the offline, the offline version. So you only execute it at the end with the command, and it would the markers would apply on your existing dialogues. But yeah, we definitely do see value in having it run real time. And yeah, future versions might consider that.
But for now, I think we're mainly using the tracker store, whatever tracker store the user uses, and we just generate a batch. Like we just run, hey, here's your markers file, here's the tracker, and then combine both, and you have your summaries in your CSV file. And I think we support all standard Rasa trackers, right? As long as it's configured in your endpoints file, then we'll pick it up.
Yes, that's right.
It's always good to double check.
Yeah.
Confirm. But I think anything that Rasa supports is in there. There is also another question. I hope I pronounced it correctly from user. Is it safe to say it makes sense that the marker is useful for forms, which is task oriented?
Um, I mean, I suppose with forms, the idea is that you're using the form to set slots. So if, in that case, it would be applicable. So the marker would apply as soon as, if you had a marker that said, check whether the slot has been set, then it would become true after the slot is set via a form. So yeah, it would be applicable in that case.
Yeah, and I can also imagine in general with forms. I mean, when a form fails, it's super interesting to know, right? Like typically, uh, if you're doing something that's task oriented, if the form fails, usually that's right before a task is done. I like depends, of course, but I can imagine. So I would definitely argue like making sure all the slots are set, and if that doesn't happen, tracking that really seems like a sound idea in general. One thing that might also just be good to mention, it's definitely in the docs that I just shared as well. But you're also able to be like a little bit creative with what you do with slots. So you can also say I want to have a separate marker if a specific slot is not set. So we have these operators that you can use as well, or not and I think are in there. Aciel, am I missing one?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the main ones, I
That's
think.
right. Yeah. So we have and or we have
Oh
sequence,
yes.
and then we have at least once and never, and we also have not, which is just a negation that goes in front of the event conditions. So maybe you want to detect all intents except a specific one, then you would say not. Whereas if you want to say this slot was never set, then you would use the never operator.
And that can be used, like thinking top of my mind, but one of the things that might be useful here is that you're able to say things like, hey, FAQ was never asked. And it can still mean success, but if a user only did FAQ, that might also be a successful task. So the idea is you're also able to not just have one definition of something you want to track, but you can have many. And it's totally up to you to just be very, to feel flexible in doing so.
Yeah, it's true. It's also it's a good idea to say, maybe you have a main success criteria, but also you have a bunch of diagnostic things to make sure that things are going well. And sometimes, you have multiple tasks, so it's not the case that you only have one success criteria and one marker for that. So you could define a number of things, like what you said, whether FAQ was never, whether FAQ never happened or did happen, and what that means for your particular application.
I'm going to move on to the next question from Tania. If you've got a bot in production for some time, how often do you recommend monitoring the success markers as a best practice? Needs or audience may evolve over time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think ideally you would have it actually running real time, and you would be tracking every conversation as it comes along. But at the moment, the feature is experimental. So this first version is, as Vincent said, is a batch process that's done offline. So it really depends on how many dialogues you process per day. It might make sense to run it every day. Might make sense to do that a bit longer. It will depend on your particular application and how often your bot interacts with users.
Like one thing, like the example I like to give is whenever the new iPhone comes out, people suddenly have all questions about the new iPhone. And that is, of course, something that will have an influence on your marker numbers as well. Like if at some point, everyone will be asking, when can I buy the new iPhone via your customer service assistant? Well, okay, then you're going to get way more FAQ kind of stuff than anything else. So yeah, it is to be expected that markers change over time as well. So in general,
that's true, I guess.
it certainly seems sound to sort of repeat the exercise on some level of regularity. The only thing I can imagine is to just be pragmatic about it. I don't think it makes sense to track it per minute. Like it feels like it might be just a little bit too fine grained. but on a daily basis might be interesting. And I can also imagine that the questions that people ask on a Saturday might also just be a little bit different than during the week. So that might be interesting as well. Then we can move on to the next question. This one is from Roby. Could it make sense to collect markers over a period of time to use them as labels to further improve or retrain models during the production life of a dialogue system?
Yes, absolutely. So this is also one of the downstream applications we were thinking of. So at the moment, the way we train our action selection component or our dialogue policy is as a classifier. So we have positive examples of good dialogues, and you just say, basically, I want you to take the same action that was taken in this dialogue. But another approach is to say, well, I want to actually just maximize something like task success instead of mimicking an exact data set. So you could first define what success means for your bot, collect a number of dialogues, and then actually optimize directly for success using something like reinforcement learning. So this is something that we will experiment with in research in the future.
I suppose another thing that could happen here, and again, this is like research future, this isn't the feature right now, but I think what also might be interesting here is to use markers as a way to guide your labeling sort of strategy. Because I can imagine, like, hey, there might be some specific failure scenarios that we can also define with these markers that might be particularly interesting. For example, if a form doesn't get filled in, okay, like I wouldn't mind like seeing at the end of every week which forms failed and why, and can we add labels to the system to prevent that? If it means that we can sort of be very we can be very picky about this form is the most important, and it's always because this entity doesn't get detected that the slot doesn't get set. Okay, then we need more entity examples. Hence, whenever that marker is triggered, give that priority during labeling. Again, like we're experimental feature right now, so that what I'm mentioning here is just stuff I would love to see in the future. But these things are also interesting, of course.
Yeah, it's true. And if you have something like, in addition to a success criteria, maybe you have a failure criteria, and you've created a marker for that, and then you want to inspect the dialogues that failed, and you might find that there are particularly difficult utterances in those dialogues, and you might want to use them as additional annotation for your NLU component, for example. So yeah, definitely useful to have a kind of feedback loop for training.
Yeah. So I'm always interested in labeling techniques. That's my little pet peeve at Rasa. That's something I concern myself with a lot. But I also think like the other direction, of course, is just the human understanding part of it. I think that's also just quite interesting. Language is difficult, right? So the conversation can go in all sorts of different ways. And I can also imagine just defining your happy path and then in hindsight looking, okay, but what is it like? I can define a happy path in a story in my mind, but then what are users actually saying? I mean, that's also just quite interesting. And being able to just say, hey, let's filter the conversation to just adhere to this one marker can also lead to a lot of qualitative understanding, which I think is also quite interesting as well. It just helps. It might be something that will help you understand the conversations more, which is also just something I wanted to make sure I've said. Having said that, let's move on to the next question as well. This one will be from we just had Roby. We are now moving on to Jonathan again. Since it is batched, is it cumulative or incremental? Does it keep track of the last time it was executed, or does it run through everything in the tracker at every run?
So there are a number of settings. So you could say that there are a number of options in the command line. So if you say all, then it will process all the trackers in your tracker store. We also added a couple of options that allow you to select the first N dialogues and also just sample a subset. So I wouldn't do exactly what Jonathan is asking, which is, maybe process the trackers that haven't been processed already. We don't have that explicit in the script. But I imagine you could implement something where you would make sure that you're just processing incoming data or a new batch of data rather than reprocessing stuff that you've processed before.
Yeah, the way that I've used it so far, and I should say, like, I haven't really been using it on a huge production system with thousands of conversations, but the way that I've just been using it so far is just to say, hey, just give me everything, and then I have a CSV file that I can just sort of dig into. And so far, that's already giving me way more information than just interacting with SQL on the tracking store. So if you're getting started, I do think it's a recommendable way to just download everything and start there, just because it gives you like everything in one go, and that's a great place to start.
That's true. It also calculates a number of statistics, summary statistics. So it's good to have the statistics calculated on the entire data set. But again, it's the first version of an experimental feature. I think a lot of these questions are really good questions, and they'll help us kind of think about the next steps and how to process, maybe incoming dialogues and incorporate them into the statistics.
About that, by the way, deserves to be mentioned as well. Because the feature is experimental, we are very eager to hear about any feedback anyone might have. So what I'm doing right now is I'm sharing the link to the Rasa forum, just to make sure if you ever have feedback, you can also use the Rasa forum, not just this, if you have a bug, of course, that's also a place where you can ask about it. But if you want to have feedback and get in contact with one of our researchers, the forum would be also the place to do it. You can definitely ping me. My username there is @Koning. And if you have a specific feature request or a specific feedback element on this feature, I can also fetch the appropriate researchers, not just for this feature, but for every research feature. We like to get our researchers involved in community as well. Just wanted to make sure I've said that as well. Moving on to the next question, and again, I hope I pronounce it correctly. Seraph, do you have a contact email for technical support for research questions? I'm studying computer science and I'm interested in writing a bachelor's thesis, which includes building a system with Rasa assistance. So definitely you're free to use the forum for that if you have any specific questions. If you have like quick questions that are just super general, feel free. My name's Vincent. You can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'll also gladly answer like general questions that you might have. We are seeing an uplift in people using Rasa for like thesis projects. Recently, there was a really, really cool one for the Thai language. So people were building their own featureizers just for Thai to see what would perform best on their data sets. Super cool. We love seeing that. So like, feel free to ask me questions if you have any general ones. If you have specific ones, though, forum is also a place for you to go. The next question is from Naresh. Can we apply markers on historical data where originally markers were not there?
Yes, you can. So what you need is the original domain for those historical dialogues. And we need that for the validation purposes. So the marker code will just check that everything you specified in the marker actually exists in your domain. So the names of the intents, the slots, the actions. And then, yeah, you could define markers for your historical data, run them and extract them. And that is one advantage of having it run as a batch or offline process, is that you can process historical data.
The only caveat that I can kind of come up with there is if you suddenly change the names of your intents, like you add a suffix to every single intent that you have, then you might also need to make sure that your markers are aware of that. That's the main caveat I can come up with. Like if you rename every single intent on a weekly basis, bad practice. But if there's a good reason for you to switch intent names, you will also have to reflect that somehow in your markers file. That's the only caveat that I can come up with here. Oh, and slot values,
so you will need a different version of markers if you've made changes to the names of your intents or slots.
I mean, theoretically, you can use the or clause here, right? I think so. You can say like, or this sequence, or this sequence, or this sequence with the old intent names, or this sequence with the new intent names. Like theoretically,
at the moment, actually, it doesn't work because if Actually, I'm not sure if it gives you just a warning or an error if domain validation fails.
Oh, it
So
has to
we
match the
do check.
domain.yaml file. Ah, right.
Yeah, we have to check against the domain.yaml file. Yeah, just to make sure that it's actually
Yeah,
that
makes sense.
that the user hasn't, or that the developer hasn't accidentally accidentally has a typo, and then if you don't flag that, then they might think that this event never happened, when in fact it's actually just a misspelling.
And it's happening all the time. Yeah, like,
Yes.
that'd be kind of a bummer if that was in there. Okay, now so that actually you're
Yeah.
right. Like, it's not gonna. We need to check the domain file for stuff like misspellings and a bunch of other things. Like,
Mhm.
slot was set. Okay, the slot needs to exist, right? Like that kind of stuff. So that okay. So those are the main caveats to consider. Like if you're renaming intents, like don't do this in general for these kinds of reasons. But that's one moment to be just kind of mindful. Um, we also get some more questions in. So the next one is from a user. Uh, is marker a Rasa X feature, or is it only available in the community edition? I believe I could be wrong, but I believe at the moment it's only in open source and not in Rasa X. Aciel, am I correct here?
That's correct. Yeah. The next step would be to actually have Rasa X support. But yeah, for now, it's just in the open source software.
Yeah, and like a thing here is that also I think it would be nice if we have just a little bit more feedback on how people want to use the markers feature before we actually start moving it into Rasa X as well, because then we have some guiding principles that could be used to sort of design the features such that it's the most practical for everyone. It is in the back of a lot of people's minds. It's just that we don't have a proper plan just yet, mainly because I think, and I could be wrong, that we're also just very keen on getting some more feedback in. And like maybe that's like a one thing that to sort of stress here, like I can imagine that the feedback that we'll get from, let's say, enterprise users, like people who have this in production at very large companies, is going to be different than from our community. People who might have made their own Slack bot, for example. But we do want to listen to both voices. So I really want to stress, like, give us feedback. It is super welcome, and we love to hear from you if you have any experience to share there. Because we really want to make sure it works for everyone. Then I will be moving on. Jonathan Wheat says, thank you. This is great and makes a lot of sense. Just read the settings portion of the docs. Smiley face. Glad to have helped, Jonathan. Then we're back from a question from Jasmine. When creating a marker, could we define intents and or actions using regex by name? I think that could be helpful to factor multiple cases, especially for big projects.
At the moment, we can't. But yeah, that's definitely something that we considered.
Yeah, and I can definitely for response selector stuff, I can imagine where if you have lots of FAQ kinds of intent names, for example, then it can get kind of verbose. We do have an or clause, I think, here that could help still a little bit. And are we limited in actions here?
Limited in actions. In what way? Sorry.
No, so I'm just kind of wondering: is there anything that no, sorry, just a brain fart. But I don't. I think we. I think we're in general good. It's just that we don't have regexes. If you have a very huge project, though, one thing that you could do, it is still just a markers file is just a YAML file in the end. How that YAML file gets generated, of course, is totally up to you. So you could use custom Python code if need be. With your own little regex library, whatever regex feature you like, to generate the YAML file on your own behalf. I could be wrong, but do we support multiple marker files at the moment?
Yeah, we do support multiple files. Yeah, so you could say this is my folder for all the marker configuration files, and you could have multiple in there.
Yeah, so that also makes it easy to have a distinction between these are like the manual marker files, and here's the one marker file that was generated programmatically. So if you really have a big need for regexes, this is the way that you could go about it, at least for now. Yeah, I think that's actually kind of a reasonable. If you have a strong use case, like do let us know in the forum. But you're not. But that's the great thing about Rasa. It's just Python in the end. So no one is stopping you from implementing anything that you want to have yourself. A great question though. Seraph then says, "I've seen that paper. Okay, thanks, Vincent. I may DM you on Twitter. Let me know. Happy to help." Jasmine then comes with not necessarily a markers question. What is the best way to create a tree structure of buttons? I use multiple intents, but with a huge tree, I need more than 1,000 intents. What do you suggest? I have a comment on that one in general that people sometimes forget about. If you want to use buttons inside of Rasa, great. Buttons can be a great user interface for a lot of people, but not every platform supports them. It depends. Like if Facebook doesn't support buttons natively, then you cannot use Rasa to send buttons to Facebook, and that's not something that Rasa could ever change. It's something that the platform defines. And the same thing holds for Slack and the web and WhatsApp. You are to some extent limited to the platform that you're deploying to, and that's something to be really aware of if you're intending to be online both on your website and on Facebook. Having said that, if you want to make a tree structure of buttons, in general, showing many buttons is typically not the way forward. A button, I think, tends to be very logical when there's only a few options to pick from, and a button is just a faster way than a user typing text. There is a project on GitHub called Rasa Action Examples. And one thing that you might want to consider there is the fallback action that's implemented there. Basically, what it'll do is it'll just say, look, I will look at the top 5 intents that are predicted right now, and I'm just going to be generating buttons for all of them. If there's not enough certainty, like the fallback classifier says, hey, we are not confident here, then this custom action can kick in to generate buttons for the top N intents. That can be a way to go about it. I think the idea is, nifty. Whether or not it will work on your assistant depends on your assistant and your users. But that might be a thing that you could consider using in your situation. And now we're going back to markers. Good question, though. Carla has another comment. Yes, Vincent, you're right. We're interested in knowing how markers are used and what people want. This was a comment referring to something was mentioned earlier. Thanks for that. And then Jasmine comes back with another question, a good one. Are entities handled by markers, or are we only supporting slots right now?
We're only supporting slots right now.
Definitely feel free with a follow-up question. If you have a use case where you really want to use entities in your markers instead of slots, we let us know. That would be interesting. So Jasmine, let us know in the chat if you can explain that. I do think again with this sort of experimental feature, we might add entities later. It's not it's not set in stone and we will never add them. It's just that for now, is that the reason? I can imagine slots are a little bit more useful because of the forms feature. Is that the main reason why they went in Aciel, or is there another thing with slots that is good to be aware of?
Well, I guess with entities, it's really an intermediate step to filling slots, right? So we do entity extraction, and that gives you something more general like city name or person's name, and then you fill a particular slot like departure city or destination city. So the slots are really the target for your bot, but entities are I think of them as an intermediate step. So it's kind of a convenient method for extracting things and then using them to fill slots. So yeah, I felt that, or we felt that slots are more important for things like defining success. But it might be that there are use cases for entities that we hadn't thought of. So it would be great to get feedback about that.
We were also just joined by a YouTube user by the name, and I hope I pronounced it correctly, Usheep. Usheep says, I joined late. Sorry if this doesn't make any sense to ask. Is it possible to use markers to find interesting conversations on Rasa X? As I understood, it uses the local database of conversations.
Yeah, it's not currently implemented on Rasa. It's just in the open source software.
Theoretically, though, like you will, the main thing, if you want to use markers on a live action store, or live tracker, so to say, the thing that markers is using is mainly just a database connection. Am I correct there?
Uh, yeah, so what it does is it reads in a static database, so it's not processing. It doesn't establish a connection to a database and uh, process dialogues as they come in. Is that what you mean?
Well, so I'm wondering, theoretically, there is also a tracker store on your Rasa X deployment.
Mhm.
So if you were on your Rasa X deployment and you were to say, hey, here's a tracker store, okay, now please make a copy of that tracker store, bring that locally, and then apply the markers. That would theoretically work, I think. It's still like how do you get the tracking data on your local machine, but then you will
Yeah.
still have your markers feature being applied to data that's currently on your Rasa X server. So I think there is a path
Yeah.
there. I'm just wondering if that's the easiest one. Know if you have any comment on
Yeah,
that.
I think that's probably the only thing you could do at the moment. So yeah, just treat your database as a static database, and you have to access it through the command line to implement to run the markers on it.
Yeah, and this will get tricky the more data is in your tracker. So if you are handling
Hmm. Yeah.
thousands of users an hour, like don't pull in the database to your hard drive. Like that'll be heavy, not just for your laptop but also for the server that's running Tracker Store. Be careful with that. But theoretically, nothing is stopping you. Like I think that is a fair comment to say. So if you're keen on trying it out, feel free to make like a subsample of your data in your Tracker Store, bring it locally, and then you can experience some of the information you're going to get out. So if you have a database that's running, this can be a way for you to sort of explore the feature.
Yeah, absolutely. So running the feature at scale is one thing that we want to consider when we introduce it into Rasa X.
I should also tell YouTube we are also joined by my cat now. The tail that you see is the feline who needs a little bit of attention. Um, since there aren't any questions right now, but definitely everyone who's watching, feel free to sort of keep them coming. I'm also kind of curious, Aciel, if you're sort of dreaming a little bit, like, hey, what kind of cool things can we do with these markers? Are there like things that you're kind of dreaming of right now? And again, like everything that we're discussing here, we're not making any promises, just to be sure. But I do like, I think it can be nice for the community to sort of, you're a researcher at Rasa. What sort of things are in your mind when you're thinking about the markers feature, just to get a glimpse of what it's like to also develop on this?
Yeah, so for me, my interests are in policy learning. So my dream is to just define success criteria and then track them and then use that to optimize the dialogue manager directly. But I can tell you some of my the dreams of my colleagues as well.
You are representing the research team at the moment, so feel free.
Yes, they would include things like a dashboard where you're tracking your success criteria over time, and maybe you have thresholds for when the the success drops beyond a certain point, and you want to go and investigate that. So it's pretty useful to think of it from an analytics point of view as well. Um, yeah, so just having multiple definitions of success, tracking them live, as some of the users have suggested, and investigating when necessary.
But what you're suggesting goes beyond labeling, I think, right? So, like learning from your system, like I think markers would be great as a proxy for your labeling strategy. But you're also, because your background's a bit more in reinforcement learning, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So you would like to have lots of markers, preferably like a marker would then become kind of the correct label or the correct state that you want your reinforcement learning agent to be in. Would I be saying it correctly if I said that?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, at the moment, we refer to too many things as state, so it can be confusing. But you're right. I was thinking of it as there's a certain state that may be successful for your or is the success state for your bot, and you want to be able to reach that, and you can do it by via reinforcement learning, which is essentially, I guess, trial and error, searching for the right path to get to that state.
So instead of it being a robot that has to sort of navigate the shortest path from A to B, and then the action space would be like, hey, do you go left or right? In this case, the action space would be more like, hey, what action do we send back to the user? Like, and the environment in this case would be the user who replies something back. Would I be
Yeah,
saying it correctly?
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you could also define things like, maybe you want, you have a way of defining customer success, customer satisfaction, multiple task, completion or task success. And you can combine those in a function that, says how much you value each of them, and then optimize it directly when you're training your model.
Would we also be able? This might be a fun one to discuss actually, because I can imagine not just for labeling but for general purposes, you might want to know when the conversation's going south, like when maybe a user is very happy, you would like to sort of make a marker for that maybe, but when a user is unhappy, you would also like to make a marker for that. Now you want to be a little bit careful because sentiment models are by no means perfect. There's tons of issues in sentiment land. But would they be easily incorporable into markers? I kind of wonder because theoretically you could set a slot for it, right? You just have an entity detector that says, "Hey, I detect high sentiment or super low sentiment, and I have a slot value for that." I don't know the consequences of actually doing this. There might be some good production reasons not to do it this way, but theoretically you could already use markers for this, right?
You could. I mean, you could also do something simpler where you ask the user at the end of the dialogue, how was the dialogue? Was it, are you satisfied or not? And then you could have a slot for that. Maybe it's a scale from 1 to 5. Maybe it's yes, no. And then you could just use the user's feedback directly. So you wouldn't necessarily need to infer how the users felt from their language, but, just ask them specifically at the end. Some users will skip that and they won't answer. Some will answer, and then that will be helpful for future iterations of learning.
Okay, that's always good to keep in mind. There is a little bit more traffic happening in the conversations. Sheep is saying, thanks. The way I tried to label interesting conversations so far was using a custom action to identify interesting conversations and to add a label to the Rasa X conversation that way. Typhon says the way I think about it is like Google Analytics funnels, where you mark a conversation where you're in a conversation path. Interesting way to think about it, actually. Hadn't considered that, but you could at some point say, this is the first marker that the user hits. This is the second marker that the user hit. Like you can, there's lots of things that you could potentially do by combining different markers. That's definitely true.
Yeah, you could use them as checkpoints. So for example, if you're filling, if you have a bot that books a flight and you have multiple slots that you're filling, so maybe each slot that you fill is kind of a checkpoint, and you could have a marker for each of them. And yeah, I guess you could create some kind of funnel there where you see maybe the majority of dialogues are going through up to the point where you ask for the destination city, and then some of them seem to be, or a large majority seem to be failing at that point. So that's also pretty useful for you. So you can go and investigate what is it about that particular slot that's making it difficult to set.
I think another example in that realm might be is that you could be able to say something like, get all the users for which the marker search flight was a success. Like you might have searching for a holiday destination feature, and then you might have book the actual holiday as a feature. And then you could do interesting things like saying, hey, of the people that actually used that search feature, how many of them actually booked? And how many actually booked and didn't book, who didn't? Like in that sense, a lot of funnel research could be done. I definitely think that's a nice analogy.
Yeah.
So someone says, I just checked Jasmine says, I just checked the markers labels and I found the at least once one. I wondered why you didn't add a at most once. Because it could be helpful in a lot of cases as the feedback.
Okay. Yeah, it's not something that we considered. Yeah. It might be interesting to get feedback about that, and maybe a specific use case that we maybe didn't think about.
because the second part of the question states, if we want to stop a user from repeating a specific scenario, a story with many, many turns, what do you suggest in that case?
I see. I might need to think a bit more about that to see if we could implement it with the current marker version. Otherwise, yeah, it would be great to have feedback or to have the feedback written in the forum thread so that we don't lose track of it.
Yeah, and another benefit of writing it in the forum track, by the way, is that not just me and Aciel can comment, but the entire research team can. So that can also be like a nice way to have a larger conversation. But this is a really good question. Thanks for that one. Then YouTube user Handlerman asks, would exporting markers to stories allow one to optimize DM? I'm not 100% sure what DM stands for, but the question
I think it's dialogue management.
Yeah, this is definitely your field. The question follows by saying, seems it's totally up to the developer to define success or failure. Wonder if having an explicit success marker or failure would help.
I see. So I think this is related to the discussion we had about optimizing the dialogue manager using these success and failure criteria. At the moment, we don't really have a syntax to say, let's take these markers and apply them to stories. But as we work on this more in research, we will most likely come up with a nice syntax and a nice interface to do that. I don't remember the rest of the question. What was it?
Would exporting markers to stories allow for one to optimize dialogue management? Seems it's totally up to the developer to define success or failure. Wonder if having an explicit success marker or failure would help.
Right. So they're saying it's up to the developer to define it, and that's true because the markers or yeah, I mean, success and failure will really depend on your task. It's similar to defining the names of your intents and actions in your domain, because there isn't a set that will be applicable to all bots. It will really depend on the domain. So we've kind of given you a language to be able to define what that means for your particular bot. And I'm not sure what they meant by explicit.
I'm guessing the part of the question here is, do we want maybe to have a machine learning algorithm tell us whether or not there was a success or a failure? Because right now it is relatively rule-based.
I see.
You need a human in the loop to say, well, this is success, this is failure. But maybe if given sufficient examples, we can have a machine learning algorithm just be a little bit more, have a little bit more recall instead of precision, maybe.
Yes, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, at the moment it's entirely rule-based, purely deterministic. Yeah, you could. It's not something we really worked on. I guess you could have something like you could come up with a model where you're annotating dialogues and you're giving it to people who are maybe experts in your particular domain, and they say this was a good dialogue, this was a bad one, and then you train a model to identify these signals like a classification task. But it's not something we worked on. We wanted something that is based on events that did occur in the dialogue. So yeah, I think there's a lot of value in just using the exact events that occurred and defining success in that way, at least to begin with. And then we could see whether actually training a model to identify those for us would be useful.
I think we just got a follow-up question. I didn't mean machine learning, but good idea. I mean, not that success is auto-detected, but typing of the markers, maybe I missed it in the docs. And the
typing the markers.
The cat needs the attention.
I see.
Sorry.
So yeah, for typing the markers. So in the docs, we gave a bunch of examples for Moodbot. But one thing we're thinking about doing is when you type Rasa init, you usually get like a domain and all the files that you need for your bot. And we could create an example marker file there for Moodbot for people to get started. And then they would adapt it for their particular domain.
Yeah, I can also imagine that's also perhaps something good to point out. It's very likely that these markers will be an iterative process. Possibly because in the beginning you might have this idea of what success might be like, so you might have like one or two obvious candidates that you for sure want to track. But then maybe there will be a couple of nice to haves, and maybe the markers that you want to use for labeling are just slightly different than the markers that you might want to have in a dashboard to sort of gauge how well the conversational bot's doing. And maybe users start asking different questions and also demand new features from your assistant. And so to make sure that's easily configurable, at least as a starting point, having intents and just having rules on that, should suffice for a lot of cases. But one thing that I have noticed is it doesn't occur to me as a thing that will be static. You are going to be changing the markers files because priorities tend to shift as well. That's my expectation, at least.
Mm-hmm.
We are nearing time soon, so let's just make sure we answer all the extra questions that just came in. User asks, I'm interested in how reinforcement learning can be applied here as a feedback to improve dialogue management or apply at runtime to influence the conversation. So are there any immediate ideas that you have on that topic?
So I guess it's just, I want to emphasize that we haven't implemented anything in Rasa at the moment, so they would have to do their own custom thing. But essentially, similar to what I was saying at throughout this conversation, define what success looks like for you, for your bot. Maybe also define what failure is, and then you could use that as a reward signal. So you could have you could assign a high reward for the successful task and a low negative reward for the failed. Sorry, I said task, I think, for the marker. So you have a success marker and a failure marker. For the success state, you can assign a high positive reward. And for the failed state, you can assign a low negative reward. And then you would have to train your model. Your optimization process will be optimizing for the success rather than the failure. Beyond that, I think just dig into the literature and.
Well, it might also there's definitely more your field than mine. But one thing that might also be good to know, to sort of just mention out there. It's not like this is a solved problem. Like reinforcement learning is actually kind of hard in this space, especially because you also like to keep it constrained. Like you don't want to just have a bot that can generate any kind of text, for example. Just Google what GPT-3 can generate, and you probably don't want that in your assistant. So how to do that is active research.
Yeah, and in this case, actually, it's you could do it in a relatively low risk way because essentially the actions that you're taking are whether you're using supervised learning or reinforcement learning are the actions that you've defined in your domain. So you're not generating text.
True.
And you could also optimize offline on your static data. And then once you're happy with the performance, deploy it. So you don't have to continuously optimize as you interact with users, which might lead your algorithm to or your policy to deviate from something if you've done it offline, then you maybe have gone through quality assurance and you're happy with the policy, you've deployed it, you collect additional data, and then you do the process again. Whereas if you let it learn on the fly, that's kind of also technically challenging to set up, but you might also not get the desired effect if it's continuously learning and kind of deviating.
That's a good point on the. So if you only use Rasa's responses in your own custom actions, then you typically are in more of a safe zone. But it is definitely active research is the main impression I've had, at least for a while. It's not like there's an obvious way to do this. It's stuff that actually needs to be researched quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean there's some, I guess, in the dialogue literature, some standard approaches where maybe they prefer shorter dialogue. So you penalize for every step. That's when you come up with the reward function. But it will really depend on your domain and whether that's actually applicable or not.
Then, due to time, I think we're nearing the final question or questions. Jonathan Wheat says, at Jasmine, what about creating a status slot you check before scenario X and setting it at the end of scenario X? If it is set that way, if it is set when that intent fires, you can either stop the user or alert them. Okay, so that was a response to something that Jasmine said. Then, as a final question, I guess we can answer Handlerman's question. To help with the auto reinforcement learning, the user would define the success markers and failure markers, but there would be a marker type that automates the reinforcement learning because it now knows success because the user defined it.
So it's, I guess, I don't know who they're referring to when they say user. So the user of Rasa open source would be, I guess, the developer who's defining success and failure. And then there's a user who interacts with the bot who is not defining success. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of questions about reinforcement learning. I should emphasize that that's not what the feature lets you do at the moment, but it's what Vincent was asking me, what ambitions I have for the feature in the future. But for now, you could definitely say, you could quantify how successful your bot is, measuring, quantifying the successful and the failed dialogues just to get an idea of how your bot is doing, and also using it for a diagnosis of the dialogues.
Maybe a final thing that is good to sort of end with as well, because you mentioned the difference between the user of the assistant and kind of the developer or the designer of the assistant. I mean, I can definitely imagine a scenario where you represent a company and they have this one little problem that they really want to solve with their virtual assistant. And let's say that this allows you to, book a holiday, but then the user might want to use the assistant to actually search for a holiday. And this is something where markers won't necessarily save the day. If there is something that your assistant simply hasn't implemented, the markers won't be able to tell you that. So even though the markers are definitely a great feature, it's, I think, a missing feature. It's great that we have it. You will still, also with reinforcement learning, will have to look at the user logs yourself once in a while, basically to figure out if the users are asking something from you that you don't offer.
Absolutely.
That's we are nowhere near automating that part.
I think you understood the question better than I did.
Oh, did I?
So thanks for the follow-up.
I thought it was just like a nice little thing to sort of end with. Like, definitely markers are a great feature, and Aciel, once again, thanks for making it. I definitely think that tracking whether or not your assistant is helping users is more valuable than any ROC curve metric ever. But still, you will have to look at your own users' data if you want to actually help them, because there's also like qualitative lessons in that that are really, really hard to automate. On that note, thanks everyone for listening. This was the Office Hour on the new Success Markers feature. I'm sharing the link to the Rasa forum one last time. Definitely give us all of your feedback. Thanks for listening, and Aciel, thanks for joining.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.